Right. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. Welcome. My name is Ramsey King. I will be hosting and just with you throughout this entire event. Work with Well Space Health, and I'm just really proud to be here for the My Brother's Keeper Trauma Healing and Learning Series, Part 2, Protected from Trauma, Advancing into the New Normal. So we have a jam-packed agenda for the day. First, I would like to get into some Zoom one-on-ones, just some etiquette. If you all could, please drop your names as well as your organizations in the chat box. We would love to see where you all are coming from, as well as if you are not speaking, we ask that you please mute yourself. And if you do happen to be called upon or you do have a question, we would definitely love to see your face. However, we ask that you use the Q&A feature to post any questions that you may have for the support team or for our guest speakers today. Secondly, I would like to introduce you all, or just really give a huge shout out and thanks to the sponsors and the supportive organizations for helping us put this together. First and foremost, My Brother's Keeper Sacramento, Public Health Advocates, Cal MHSA, Kaiser Permanente, UC Davis, ACES Connections, Well Space Health, and the Center at Sierra Health Foundation. So like I mentioned, we do have a jam-packed agenda today, and I'm just super excited to get into all of this. First, we'll start off with some land acknowledgements by Dalton Brown. We'll then get into a youth performance by Eric Marcel, as well featuring Jasmine. We'll hop into MBK Healthy Development Pillar Overview, given to us by our Mr. D'Angelo Mack, as well as Sacramento Updates by Ray Green. And then, of course, the awaited keynote presentation by Dr. Boyd and an enriching discussion with Dr. Boyd and Dr. Tiffany Johnson. We'll then hop into another youth performance, and we'll talk into some next steps as well as evaluation with Dr. Christina. Let's get into it. Excuse me. And then we'll go ahead and close it out. So with that being said, I would like to introduce the individual who will be giving us a grounding in land acknowledgement, and that is Mr. Brown, who is the Executive Director of Administration with Wilton Rancheria in Elk Grove, California. So if you could, Dalton, introduce yourselves and take it away.
Machixis Kuchiama, Kaniayase Dalton Brown. Hello, good day. My name is Dalton Brown. As was said by Ramsey, I am the Executive Director of Administration. Thank you, Flo. I'm the Executive Director of Administration for Wilton Rancheria. We are a federally tribe located in Elk Grove, California. We are the only federally recognized tribe in Sacramento County. It was an honor to get reached out to. Katie reached out yesterday to make sure I could hop on. I'm happy to do. But it is an honor to be able to talk to you a little bit about Wilton Rancheria, our people, and our district. Wilton Rancheria was formally established in 1928 by an act of Congress, setting aside land for what was considered vagrant Indians in the state of California. This is after years and years of legal dispossession, of treaties being not signed, of promises broken by the federal government. Our tribe then existed as a rancheria until 1959, when the United States federal government sought to rid itself of any responsibility to tribes that it could, Wilton Rancheria being one of them. We were terminated by the Rancheria Acts in 1959, which meant we lost all federal recognition status. We could not access federal programs, federal services. But after years of fighting by our ancestors and our elders, we were re-recognized by the federal government in 2009 under President Obama. Since then, we have passed our constitution. We've established our tribal government. We have 3 branches, almost the same as the federal government does: the executive, legislative, and judicial. We serve over 800 tribal members here in the greater Sacramento area. We are a strong community. I think something that's really special about us is right now we don't have an economic engine. We don't have a gaming facility like other tribes do, but we've continued to provide amazing services to our people despite the years and years of constantly overcoming oppression and overcoming obstacles that have been put in front of our tribal nation. I like to give credit to Dr. Bush from Cosumnes River College down here in Elk Grove. And oftentimes when he talks about land acknowledgements, he says that acknowledgements are nice, but they mean nothing without atonement to many people. And recognizing the fact that Sacramento County is stolen land, it's important to offer ways that we can invest in tribal communities. So I would encourage everyone to please, take opportunities when you travel for work. If you have power within your workplace, encourage folks to stay at tribally owned enterprises, hotels, restaurants. Anytime you can find, a vendor who is a tribal person, encourage, your organizations to invest in them and allow them to provide services to your organization. I think it's a beautiful thing to be able to be here. My younger brother was part of the first convening of My Brother's Keeper back in DC with President Obama years and years ago. And a funny story about that is that my dad, who's all of 5'8", got sat 2 rows behind Shaq at that. So he couldn't see a thing during the whole My Brother's Keeper event. So it's an amazing thing to see that MBK is continuing to grow and thrive in Sacramento County. And I think something that I've heard before that's really important to recognize is that Indigenous sovereignty does mean Black liberation, and the coexistence of our communities and making sure that we are holding one another up and supporting one another in any way possible is incredibly important. I'm honored to be able to do that through my role and the work that I do. And I look forward to the opportunity to work with any of you today. I hope that today, goes well. I wish I could stay on, but it's been an honor and a privilege to speak to you all. Katie, D'Angelo, Flo, I'll talk to you guys soon. Flo, tribally owned places, let me see what I can put together and I'll shoot it to you in an email and see if that's something you can get sent out, but I appreciate that. Otherwise, I hope everyone really enjoys today. Take care and blessings to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalton. I appreciate that. We appreciate that. All right, so we're going to hop into our Youth Spotlight performance. I would like to introduce to you all Eric Marcel featuring Jasmine from Sacramento, who are Sacramento-based creatives. And if you two could, we do have a few minutes or a couple of moments for you to just briefly introduce yourselves and talk about the project that you'll be sharing with us today.
So, my name is Eric Marcel.
And my name is Jasmine Moss.
And pretty much we're cousins, and we both grew up in music, and we love it to death, and we're just thankful for the opportunity to be able to share our craft with you guys today. So this song's called Come By. Let me tell you about some things you just pen as a diary, inquiring questions about the people in society. And honestly, I just be trying to be the lot of things. And honestly, I just be tired of a lot of things. My problem is I care for people who don't reciprocate it. I was unaware like Wayne. I ain't got no ceilings covered up on my holes, on my scars, on my toes. The trauma, yeah, I solved them like trigonometry, failed algebra 3. But bankrolls been helping now my accounting. So now I'm saluting all the men and women spending all their cheddar out on letters of approval from my peers to 18 plus a year to figure out my sound, my lane. I'm here to stay cause I really live it. Day back to the early music. I was in my Truey cruising down in my Benz. My ends slowly running cause I'm funneling all my money into something that can make my dreams what it seems from the outside. Really, I'm just separating myself like apartheid from society, and by any means, I'm a reign supreme like a hype beast. Boss logo on
So
a white
baby,
tee.
just come by whenever you want to, and baby, I'll be here whenever you fall through. So baby, just come by whenever you want to, and baby, I'll be here whenever you fall through.
That's where I got my hunger from, to teach me that I'm not any one and done. I'm the only one. So shout goes out to Cove. I'm sold that I'm the greatest, but I know that you don't know. So I know that I'm in layman's terms just a rookie playing hooky just to spit rhymes. But come crunch time with the game tied, I'm a reign supreme to clean age 19, making sure that I'm up next. Ayo,
So
Jasmine
baby,
sing.
just come by whenever you want to, and baby, I'll be here whenever you fall through. So baby, just come by whenever you want to, and baby, I'll be here whenever you fall through.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was beautiful. Wow. And I would like to say, this is the reason why we do this work, is to uplift and inspire young folks to just creatively be themselves and to really just heal. And, they are our future. So thank you to Eric, Marcel, and Jasmine for a beautiful performance. And as you can see, we got the comments blowing up right now. So keep doing your thing. We appreciate you. So we do have a couple minutes, which I see we're a little ahead of schedule, but I want to introduce and give the floor to Mr. D'Angelo Mack. If you could, please, my brother, give us a healthy development pillar overview and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Ramsey. I'm a Cancer, y'all, so I'm a little emotional right now. That was dope, and Ramsey is correct. This is why we do the work. It's even more touching because I met Eric and Jasmine just recently, at least I thought I did. And come to find out, our babies, they grow up and then they get big faces and then they look kind of like adults and you kind of forget. But I was reminded as I was working with them last night, and my daughter was here in the kitchen over Zoom. They saw my daughter, and they were just like, "Yes, man!" Right? And then I was reminded that Eric went to middle school with my daughter, and Jasmine graduated, high school with Jasmine, and I've heard Jasmine sing at a bunch of Sac High events. So thank you so much, Eric and Jasmine, and we'll get to hear them again towards the end of this session. Yeah, man, I'm telling you, for these are all of our children. We will either profit by or pay for what they become. That's Mr. James Baldwin, and that is the truth. The reason why we do this is for young people. MBK is set up to support young boys and young men of color, and intervene in that social gap that is there, which was created by historical issues that we can spend hours talking about. But I just wanted to talk just real quickly about why we created this space, why we brought you all together to talk about this intersection of race, racism, and healthcare. I've been doing this work for a very long time, and working in the health systems for, the majority of that time. I've worked with youth very closely. And I've seen how healthcare has treated young people, and specifically people of color. Running a violence intervention program with my partners, Maya and Chris, I've seen racism firsthand. I've seen the effects of the social determinants of health in our communities. And I wanted to really address those things in a way that supported practitioners doing the work for those who are Black and brown. And so this work comes from me working with a lot of young victims of violence, those injured, shot, stabbed, or assaulted, seeing them in the hospital, in hospital beds, and how they were treated and viewed as perpetrators and not victims. This actual convening came about from hundreds and hundreds of their stories. One in particular, a young man who was shot and paralyzed from the neck down. He was trached, and our nursing staff and doctors had to work with him and had difficulty working with him. Nurses and some doctors didn't want to actually work with him because they felt he was combative. Combative how? Like, this kid can't move. Nurses didn't want to take shifts. They didn't want to go in the rooms and take care of him because they felt he was disrespectful. And my work was to explain to them This is a 17-year-old kid that will never, ever walk again, never experience life the way we experience life. Of course, he's frustrated. Of course, he's angry, right? And teaching them what trauma-informed practice looks like, teaching them what empathy looks like. And so it's through stories like that that this platform has been created. We wanted you to be able to come into this room, hear some great keynote speakers, hear the great work that we're doing, and actually apply it to your everyday work life. Some of us go into work and work our shifts and go home, but for others, this is our lives. We can't turn it off. We can't erase or remove the skin we were born in. And so this is an opportunity for us to come together and listen. As my grandma said, you have one mouth and two ears, and learn, right? And learn. And after we listen and learn, action, apply these things. And so we thank you. We thank you for coming into this space. It is a safe space. It is a place where we can ask questions and grow together. And so again, we just thank you for being a part of this trauma healing and learning series. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mack. All right, Ray Green, if you could give us some My Brother Keeper Sacramento updates. See, we got the baby on the call too. Hi, little one.
I do. I had to grab her after hearing the young people share their voices. So she shares hers, give her space. Anyhow, I just want to welcome everybody. My name is Ray Green. I have the honor and privilege to serve as the My Brother's Keeper Sacramento Community Coordinator. Excited to have each and every one of you on. I believe this is a record for us via Zoom. So I know that this will be a really, really great and special treat. I simply have some announcements from MBK Sacramento that I would like to share. Just simple three, and then I'll get out of your way. For those who don't know, we serve as the My Brother's Keepers Collaborative. And this strategy team, the Healthy Development Strategy Pillar, is actually doing this ongoing. So if you haven't participated before, make sure that you come back again. You will be receiving the recording via email. We'll send an email blast out to everybody. And we want to make sure that you stay engaged. Beyond that, we want to make sure that you also get involved. I just put in the link right now, some different ways that you can get involved if you're in Sacramento County. Right now, we are excited to say, go visit our website, which is right there at shfcenter.org/MBKSAC. This is where you can get involved. You can get all of the updates that we have from our launching of our 1300 campaign to get 1,300 additional young men of color to Sac State and UC Davis. I see you, UC Davis. That's my alum. Shout out, go Aggies. But you can see all of our updates. You can follow us on Instagram. You can look at the publications that our MBK Youth Fellows have provided over the years, as well as our MBK Guide to Action. All of that is on the website. But if you specifically say to yourself, I'm a part of this, but how else can I get involved? Click Get Involved. There's an opportunity to get involved at multiple levels beyond just the healthy development pillar. MBK Sacramento really is committed to improving educational, health, social, economic outcomes for local boys and men of color. So as you go to that Get Involved tab, what you will be able to select are all of those options if you feel necessary to. So we want to open that up to you. The second is our MBK Youth Fellowship. We have some phenomenal young men of color here in Sacramento. Some of them are here on the call. This is where we are. It's a leadership, brotherhood, civic engagement. They put all the policy briefs, all the work that our coordinating committee and strategy teams carry. And we want to make sure that if you have any young men that you would like to recommend, simply just email me at rgreen@sierrahealth.org, and I will get back to you. Our goal is to launch late January, early February. So please email me any young men between the ages of 16 and 20. We would love to engage them at that opportunity. The last is a funding opportunity. This doesn't come from the My Brother's Keeper. This actually comes from the Center at Sierra Health Foundation, where I serve as. And this is a trauma-informed wellness program for African-American and Black communities in Sacramento County, specifically a partnership throughout the county. The center is awarding eligible community-based agencies, including nonprofits, for-profits, private and public partnerships, to provide trauma-informed community outreach, to provide support services, address mental health and wellness of the African-American and Black communities. There is a webinar. There's actually two. I only listed one, but all of this will be sent out to you. November 9th, there's a webinar. The registration link is there in the chat. It will be sent out to you. The application is due November 30th. Yes, November 30th. Funds up to $225,000 will be dispersed to those who qualify on January 1, 2021. It's a 3-year grant. So look forward to that. If I was to leave you with anything, I would say, as we enter into this conversation, continually think through how we can reduce those trauma efforts and policies, procedures, and practices. They're up at the top left or right of my screen. I thank you all again, and I hope that you get involved with MBK Sacramento. Appreciate it. Back to you.
Thank you, Ray. We have a couple of updates. So what we'll do is, I believe Chris Cooper will be introducing our speakers today. And then I know it'll be a mix between D'Angelo. I'll let you take it away. But if we're going to have Chris go ahead and move forward, I'd like to introduce Chris Cooper to you all.
Sorry, Ramsey. I will introduce the speakers for Chris this time. So yeah, before we introduce the speakers, I just want to let you all know that our Indigenous partners, they shared a number that we can text, and with that number, it'll tell you what Indigenous lands you're on and give you a link to more information. And so we'll put that telephone number in the actual chat so that folks can contact that number and find more information. So yeah, I am charged with introducing our moderator and speaker. Today, I am super excited to do this because both of these individuals are rock stars and icons in their own right. They play in the same sandbox because they're both pediatricians doing phenomenal work. I just want to lift up our moderator first, Dr. Tiffany Johnson. She said that I can go off the dome and not use her bio, so I'm excited about that. But Dr. Johnson, she's a emergency room pediatrician with UC Davis, and more so just a renowned figure around the United States and across the land. She is an expert in race relations when it comes to medicine and pediatrics. She is, of course, a member of our great MBK Healthy Development Strategy team. And my most important fact about her, she is my friend and my sister. And I am so, so glad that she is a part of this great work with us. So thank you, Dr. Johnson. And now I want to just lift up our keynote speaker, Dr. Rhea Boyd. Dr. Boyd is an MD, MPH. She is a pediatrician, public health advocate, and scholar who writes and teaches on the relationship between structural racism, inequity, and health. She has a particular focus on the child and public health impacts of harmful policing practices and policies. She serves as the Chief Medical Officer of San Diego's 211, working with navigators to address social needs of San Diegans impacted by chronic illness and poverty. And she is the Director of Equity and Justice for the California Children's Trust, an initiative to advance mental health access to children and youth across California. Dr. Boyd graduated cum laude with a BA in Africana Studies and Health from the University of Notre Dame. She earned an MD at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine and completed her pediatric residency at the University of California, San Francisco. In 2017, Dr. Boyd graduated from the Commonwealth Fund Mongan Minority Health Policy Fellowship at Harvard University School of Public Health and earned an MPH. Dr. Boyd is an amazing figure in our community. I had the privilege of hearing her speak at our Racing Aces event a couple months ago. And I said to myself, she's got to be my friend. So I'm super excited to hear from her today. And without further ado, we introduce and give a warm welcome to Dr. Rhea Boyd.
Hey, y'all. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Thank you, Ray, for bringing Destiny. She's so precious. Let me just share my screen. And D'Angelo, just to check, what time should I stop so that we transition to Kicking It with Tiffany?
I'm the wrong person to ask about time because I say just go as long as you need to. But you got about 40 minutes, 45 minutes.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure. If I'm running late, y'all just stop me. Okay, can y'all see this? Let me make it a little bigger now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. It's really an honor to be here. I love My Brother's Keeper. I followed y'all's work kind of from the periphery. So it's so awesome to be invited in with y'all. I am living and working on Ohlone territory, and I left my Twitter handle on this first page in case folks want to follow up with me after, or if there's questions we don't have time for. I titled this presentation, The Crooked Room, and it's what we talked about at Racing Aces. We're going to talk about the connections between racism, childhood adversity, and child and adult health. I call it The Crooked Room because right now in our state, there are kind of two ways for us to talk about childhood adversity. And one way is a medicalized way of understanding adversity. And the other is the way I'm going to present to you today, which is a socio-political analysis of where adversity comes from and what we should do about it. And so we're going to talk a bit about some of the decisions that are being made in our state right now to address adversity, and think about what we can be doing as organizers, community members, and decision makers ourselves to affect change, to ensure that folks aren't harmed by these processes that are going on. So let's jump in. I don't have any disclosures. So what do I mean by the crooked room? I take this metaphor and reference from this book by Melissa Harris Perry, Sister Citizen, which was trying to talk more about the US democracy from the lens of Black women. And what she acknowledges that the crooked room is actually a post-World War II cognitive psychological research study on what's called field dependence. Field dependent studies show how individuals locate the upright in a space. In one study, subjects were placed in a crooked chair in a crooked room and then asked to align themselves vertically. Some perceived themselves as straight only in relation to their surroundings. To the researchers' surprise, some people could be tilted by as much as 35 degrees and report that they were perfectly straight, simply because they were aligned with images that were equally tilted. But not everyone did this. Some managed to get themselves more or less upright, regardless of how crooked the surrounding images were. And Melissa Harris Perry goes on to share that when they confront race and gender stereotypes, Black women are standing in a crooked room. They have to figure out which way is up. Bombarded with warped images of their own humanity, some Black women will tilt and bend themselves to fit the distortion. And so applying this to all of us, as I present this particular way of thinking about adversity, I want us all to be attentive to the ways that we might have been tilting ourselves to something that didn't quite fit how we understood how adversity works and what we should be doing about it. So to start with a socio-political analysis of adversity, we have to acknowledge that inequality is extreme in this country and it's getting worse. The top 1% of earners hold more wealth than the bottom 80% in this country, and our state of California is leading the way. Part of the reason why there's a huge gap between earners is because wage stagnation is profound. Folks aren't earning more now than they used to. This is a chart looking at non-supervisory employees, folks who work, but you're not the boss. They essentially make the same per hour that they made in 1973, more than 50 years ago. And so what that means is the purchasing power of our entire workforce across the country has barely increased in half a century. And so the reality is we are now a part of a generation for whom only half of our children will out-earn their parents. And we know intergenerational economic mobility is profoundly shaped by race and gender in this country. This is data by Raj Chetty, who is a researcher who used to be at Stanford, but is now at Harvard. And what he shows is those gaps in intergenerational mobility by race and gender. So if you look on the right at that green and yellow map, what it shows is that it essentially pays to be a little white boy who grows up to be a white man in the United States. Because no matter where he lives, he is likely to earn more in adulthood than his parents did when he was a child. Now, conversely, if you look at that red and orange map, you see that there's really nowhere safe to be a little black boy who grows up to be a black man in the United States. Because virtually everywhere he lives, he is likely to earn less in adulthood than his parents did when he was a child. As Chetty and his colleagues summarized, in 99% of neighborhoods across the country, including our progressive Bay Area and California, Black boys are going to earn less in adulthood than white boys, despite growing up in remarkably similar families. And this is what really blew me away about this study. These two little boys both grow up in households with both parents. Both of their households have comparable levels of income. They have comparable levels of education. They have comparable levels of wealth, and they live on the same city block, and they go to the exact same school. So what is it that's driving these mobility gaps? What they found is that the intergenerational economic mobility gaps are smallest in parts of the country where there's low racial bias among whites, where white folks are less racist, and where there's high father presence in Black neighborhoods. Now, this isn't father presence in your home. This is father presence on your city block. And so we have to ask ourselves, what's the relationship between white folks' racism and father presence in Black communities? And we have to then confront even casual forms of white racism, or what Michael Harriot, journalist from The Root, calls white collar crime, CALLER. When white folks call the police on Black folks simply for existing in public, we as a public have then decried the potential harassment, intimidation, violence, and arrest that might invite on that individual. But we don't take note of what that means for the community. And if that interaction with police results in that individual's death, incarceration, or prolonged hospitalization, such that it extracts a father from a Black neighborhood, the impact of that reverberates across the entire community and results in those devastating mobility gaps, particularly between Black and white boys. And so this is the inequality. This is another picture of that same map. This is the inequality that already existed in this country before COVID-19 even broached our shores. And if you overlay a map of current places where COVID has an outbreak, you see that it aligns really closely to areas where there's wide gaps in economic mobility, areas where inequality is vast. And as we know, part of that inequality then becomes manifest in racial health inequities. So this is data looking from April, when the nation first started to acknowledge the racial health inequities emerging from the pandemic, just to a few weeks ago. And what you see is that rather than those inequities narrowing, they are widening over time. Overall, Black Americans have the highest COVID-19 mortality rate. It's 3.2 times that of white Americans. Latinx populations have an incredibly high mortality rate that's also more than 3 times white Americans, but nationwide, indigenous populations have the second highest COVID mortality rate, followed by Pacific Islanders, who I think as a population has been lost in a bit of our national conversation about the impact of COVID on racial and ethnic groups. When we look particularly at kids, you see that same we see those same inequities emerging. So although we as a country have been talking particularly about how COVID affects adults, we see those same racial health inequities for kids. This is data from the CDC that looks at death rates from COVID-19 for all individuals who are 21 years old and younger. And what we see is that Black and Latinx young folks make up 74% of COVID deaths. So when we talk about why folks have a risk for COVID, we typically say things like this. Well, they had an underlying condition, something like heart disease or diabetes, or they were really old, they were elderly, or they lived in poverty, and so they didn't have adequate access to healthcare. But what we need to start saying is that, well, segregation actually profoundly shapes the racial distribution of heart disease in this country. Chronic discrimination actually drives rates of hypertension to be higher within Black communities. Environmental racism determines who breathes in clean air and who breathes in toxins, and thus who has higher rates of asthma and why we see spikes of asthma within communities of color. The racial wealth gap profoundly shapes who's poor and concentrates poverty within communities of color. Toxic stress and early exposures to adversity can raise an individual's allostatic load, which means it increases the wear and tear on all of your organ systems, which then weathers your cells, which means it silently ages and kills the cells in your organs. That means a person's cellular age could actually be advanced of your chronological age, and you could suffer complications from something like COVID at much younger ages than expected. These are all examples of how structural racism has profoundly shaped who has COVID. Because in the words of one of my favorite pediatricians, and I know it's one of Tiffany's favorite pediatricians as well, Dr. Kamara Jones, it's inherited disadvantage that drives risk for diseases like COVID, not just underlying illness. And so this shows you how both the physical, but also the structural, the legal environment in which humans, all of us, are growing, working, learning, and playing shapes not only our health, but the health of our children and our children's children. So when we talk about the inequitable risk of COVID, and I put a star here by risk to remind us that we're thinking at the population level, where systematic drivers impart risks to groups, instead of at the individual level, where an individual's behavior might shape their health outcomes. At the population level, what's making people at risk for COVID complications isn't simply poverty or underlying illness. Instead, it's legacies and current practices of racial exclusion, discrimination, disinvestment, and violence that concentrates disadvantage within communities of color, creates adversity for children of color, and shapes the population level opportunity to be well, and provides the perfect conditions for folks in communities of color to be sick. It's those factors that are why all-cause mortality, death rates from every disease cause, is increasing in our country. And that's driven by an increase in mortality rates for non-Hispanic Black folks, that yellow line, non-Hispanic Indigenous populations, the gray line. Indigenous populations have the highest mortality or death rate from every cause in this country, and by non-Hispanic white folks, the blue line. Because of that increasing all-cause mortality, life expectancy is decreasing in our country. How long we will live because we live in the United States is going down. That is an aberration for any wealthy nation in the world, but especially for the one that spends the most on healthcare of any other country. And so what we see is that despite the enormous mortality burden of COVID on our population, COVID is now the third leading cause of death this year. Despite that, white mortality is still likely to be less than what Black Americans have experienced every year pre-COVID. This is a chart from the New York Times, and what you see is that dotted line is the jump in white mortality that is alarming just from COVID alone. But then you see that huge chasm between that jump in white mortality and what Black folks experienced at baseline. We have to acknowledge that this chart doesn't even include Black mortality from COVID, which is the highest mortality rate and is likely above this line. It doesn't include Indigenous mortality pre or post-COVID, which is likely above the Black line. This is why researcher Elizabeth Wrigley Field has said racial inequality is as deadly as COVID-19, because right now in 2020, in the midst of the most deadly pandemic our nation has seen in 100 years, white life expectancy, how long white folks live, is going to be higher than Black life expectancy has ever been. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are those legacies and practices that are contributing to that enormous gap in mortality and the health inequities we see from this pandemic? When we think of that legacy, we often go back to this time, to the Jim Crow South and segregated public accommodations like bus depots or water fountains like in this picture. But we don't as often go back to this time. This is a picture from Newark, New Jersey in 1967, in what historians now call the long, hot summer of 1967. They call it the long, hot summer because during that summer, there were 159 race massacres across the United States, all sparked by an event of police violence against a Black taxi driver in Newark, New Jersey. When we think about those gaps in mortality rates driven by gaps in disease rates in communities of color, we don't talk about what it feels like to be this little Black boy walking down your own city block with your government at your back. That's the National Guard who was called in, and their guns are drawn and your hands are up because you don't feel safe in your own community. We don't talk about what it's like to be these Black women who line the sidewalk, whose hands are also up, who are not intervening because they also don't feel safe. Or what it's like to be that little Black boy on the left side of this photo, who's looking back at a boy who's perhaps just a bit older than he is, and he's understanding something specific about what it means to be Black and a boy in this country. We don't talk about the ways that state-sanctioned violence absolutely contributes to racial health inequities and to mortality gaps in this country. And so we're going to talk about it because not much has changed since 1967. This is a Pulitzer Prize winning photo that covered Time magazine in 2015 after police murdered Freddie Gray in Baltimore. And photographer Devin Allen asked the apt question, what has changed in 2015? And we continue to ask that question right now in 2020. And so when we think about those factors, those systematic drivers that contribute to the racial health inequities we've seen from this pandemic, we absolutely have to talk about police violence. So what do we know about police violence? We know about 1,000 people are killed by police every year in this country. And we know it's a particularly deadly exposure for Black men and boys. 1 in 1,000 Black men and boys will be killed by police in their lifetimes. I always say this figure to pediatricians because 1 in 1,000 is also the mortality rate of measles. When you think about the near constant public health surveillance and investment we as a society have placed in eradicating measles because we deem it that deadly, and you compare it to the relative little to nothing we as a healthcare infrastructure have done to eradicate police violence, you see the ways that racism not only shapes deadly exposures in this world and in our country, but also shapes our public health response. Sometimes racism looks like inaction in the face of need, which is also a quote from Dr. Kamara Jones. So let's look at what we mean when we're talking about police violence in our own state here in California. We're lucky to live in a state in which when police use force, it's mandated that they report it. And then that reporting becomes publicly available through our open justice portal, which was brought to us by our then Attorney General, Kamala Harris. So what we see is when police use force in 2019, 1 out of 5 times somebody died. Now, usually it's those deaths that garner public attention and media outcries. But what's actually far more common is that 2 out of 3 times about, somebody's going to suffer a serious bodily injury. So now we have to ask ourselves, well, why did police come to the scene in the first place when they used force? And this is what's most devastating about it. Almost half of the time when police use force, they came to the scene because somebody called for help. Just think about that. Somebody called for help, police use force, and in our state, 1 out of 5 times, somebody's going to die. And almost 2 out of 3, somebody's going to suffer a serious bodily injury. This is why we are having a statewide and national conversation about reimagining public safety, because we can no longer call an institution that so reliably harms folks when you call for help one that keeps us all safe in the same ways. Also, when we think about the effect of police violence on youth health, we have to acknowledge that kids don't even need to be directly exposed for it to affect their whole life course. Why? Because sometimes when police use force, the result of that in a child's life is that their caregiver doesn't show up to pick them up from school or doesn't come home from work at night. That may feel like a custody transition. Those shifts in relationships to caregivers are profoundly impactful on a child's health. It's a major driver of what we call childhood adversity. And that's why even routine police encounters that trigger those experiences for kids that are associated with loss of their caregivers or stress, then those routine encounters can also affect their health and well-being. That means the violence of policing ultimately can separate kids from the social networks on which they rely and in which they thrive. And the violence of racism and the many structural inequalities that racism creates for groups, for populations, ultimately impairs and disappears. It removes caregivers from the lives of kids. And that is why racism is a critical root of childhood adversity. This is a figure by researcher Wendy Ellis that looked at the questions that we usually ask when we ask about childhood adversity, which are the questions on the top of the tree. Have you experienced divorce or maternal depression, for example? But the drivers, the roots of those experiences are all exposures that are shaped by racism. Things like discrimination, poverty, violence, and poor housing. And so racism then is a devastating root of chronic undertreated disease and completely preventable premature death. And so to advance anti-racist praxis and health equity, we actually have to challenge our political economy in this country. Why do I say that? I say that because we have a political economy that profits off of racial inequality. Those gaps exist because they're profitable. That began with indigenous dispossession and slavery, and it continues today, where our economy extracts or takes resources away from those who have the greatest need and relocates them upwards towards those who already hold wealth. That's why we have that enormous gap in earners and wealth in this country between the 1% and the top and the bottom 80%. And it's why we see those racial mobility gaps between Black folks in particular and the rest of the US economy. We have a political economy that relies on policing to then reinforce those gaps. And so together, these structures systematically divest from communities of color to take their resources and their tax dollars and send them up to corporations and wealthy elites. These structures systematically separate families, right? It separates our families, and it disproportionately pathologizes and criminalizes minoritized groups, groups whose numbers are small because they're made to be small. And so if we acknowledge the violence of racism and the adversity that it engenders for our entire population in this state, then we have to ask ourselves, well, where have we invested the lion's share of our newest state resources to address adversity? This is a slide from ACEs Aware that's publicly available from one of their virtual meetings in June 16th. And what you see is that we've invested the lion's share of our state's newest resources in provider payments to pay physicians and ACEs training. And it's no small sum. It's less than what was predicted to be allocated in the proposed January budget because COVID has initiated cuts across the state government, but it's still tens of millions of dollars that we are investing in an elite, predominantly white class in our state to address adversity, which is a problem born of inequality. when you look at that investment, we have to acknowledge that we're also the state where 1.8 million students, almost 1 out of every 3 public school students, have a police officer in their school, but no psychologist, no nurse, no social worker, and no counselor. And so, acknowledging the violence of racism and the adversity that it creates, what tools are we using as a state to address adversity as a socio-political problem? Well, we're using a screener that's known as the Pearl Screener, which asks questions about how youth or children have basically had separations from their caregivers or been exposed to harmful or impaired caregiving. But here I turn to the words of one of the original ACEs researchers, Dr. Robert Onda. He published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine just in March of this year. And he said a caution that I think we need to hold in this state incredibly seriously. So I'm just going to read this. He said, despite its usefulness in research and surveillance studies, the ACE score, the Adverse Childhood Experience score, is a relatively crude measure of cumulative childhood stress exposure that can vary widely from person to person. Unlike recognized public health screening measures, such as blood pressure or cholesterol levels that use measurement reference standards and cut points or thresholds for clinical decision-making, the ACE score is not a standardized measure of childhood exposure to the biology of stress. He goes on to say the authors are concerned that ACE scores are being misappropriated as a screening or diagnostic tool to infer individual client risk and misapplied in treatment algorithms that inappropriately assign population-based risk for health outcomes from epidemiologic studies to individuals. So we really have to ask ourselves, is the efforts in our state to advance ACE screenings actually a research study that is masquerading? And I mean that in a kind way. It's potentially a research study that on its face looks like an intervention. If that's true, if as the researcher, Dr. Onda suggested, that these are actually research questions best used in research, if we use them as screenings, are we doing so without informed consent, which is the process by which people are made aware that you are a part of a research study when you are made to answer such probing and private questions about your life? So we have to ask ourselves, what's the relationship between how we start to understand and address population health, the health of groups, and how we might generate and contribute to population racism? That's a term that's not my own. It's from Ruha Benjamin, who is a researcher at Princeton. So here I think in our state, we also have this paradox about how data works, because in healthcare, we always want more information about folks. We want that because in a certain sense, on the left side, data could describe and capture the health implications of social inequality. If we don't chart the impacts of racism, we might miss them. But on the other side, on the right, data gathering can also create and reinforce social inequality. And so we have to be mindful of that balance and find which side we're on. If we think about the good use case scenario where data helps us better understand people's healthcare outcomes, this is the central premise. It's that if healthcare systems know more about people, they will treat them better, which even when you say it like that, I myself have to think, is that true? Like, if they know more about me, they're going to treat me better than they did before, particularly if you know the history of racial health inequities that emerge just from unequal treatment in the healthcare system? Is it just a barrier to knowing something about me that will help the system treat me better? I think the concern is that ACEs scores could actually become a gatekeeper for reimbursable behavioral health services. This is a bulletin announcement from Medi-Cal that was covered in ACEs Connection that highlighted that in law now, in the Medicaid code, family therapy, and I blow this out here so you can see it, family therapy is also reimbursable for prevention of mental health conditions in children with specified risk factors. Well, we need to know, what are those specified risk factors? Well, first, they're not simple ACEs scores, which is great. It includes things that are on the ACEs screener, but also other important exposures to adversity, like food insecurity, being unhoused, exposures to discrimination, and certain parental experiences, which again, most of these are captured on the ACEs screener, but are not the score itself. It's not the number. It's not reducing these risk factors to a number. So if children or their parents have any of these risk factors, they then get qualified for 5 sessions of family therapy. In a sense, this is good. And I want to be clear here, because in Medicaid, mental health access is an entitlement for kids. That means everybody gets it as a preventative service, as a part of what's known as EPSDT, early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment. Mental health access should work like vaccines for kids, which is also an entitlement under EPSDT. Everyone should get it as a preventative service, meaning you actually don't have to have any impairment to get it. You don't need to have a diagnosis to get it. Just a risk factor should mean that you can get mental health access. So this could be a good thing. But then just earlier this week, DHCS announced that eligibility for specialty mental health services to actually see a psychiatrist will use threshold ACEs scores. This is concerning. It's concerning because labels like specified risk factors or those ACEs scores aren't just benign in kids' medical charts and in their lives. Just like diagnoses, which we're trying to get away from for mental health access for kids because it should be a preventative service, just like diagnoses, the labels like these risk factors or these scores, when encoded in folks' charts, can follow patients and render them vulnerable to scrutiny from their providers about what's going on into their home, surveillance from the child welfare system, and CPS involvement. As we know, mandated reporters like teachers and pediatricians like me have the power to extend the carceral gaze, to extend surveillance into kids' and families' lives through CPS referrals. And inappropriate referrals render those populations hypervisible to the state in ways that reinforce racial inequality. We know that happens because if you look across the United States, by the age of 18, 1 in 2 Black children will have had a CPS investigation. 1 out of every 2. We already know that our healthcare infrastructure over-refers Black families to CPS. And as was stated in The Imprint, which is formerly the Chronicle of Social Change, just in August, in an article on, it's called Painful Questions, and it's asking some of these questions that I'm posing for you today about our state's approach to ACEs. They acknowledge, and I underlined here, critics also warn that answers on the forms could lead more families in low-income and Black and Brown communities to be entangled with child welfare authorities. It's something that we have to be aware of and we have to fight against. And so what's the other flip side? How can data use reinforce social inequality? This is an example from Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, they use a child abuse prediction model. So instead of everybody who just gets referred by a mandated reporter going directly to CPS, it goes through an algorithm first. But that algorithm only takes data from patients who receive a form of public assistance. And researcher Virginia Banks calls that poverty profiling. As she says, even though you're trying to understand a community level risk, if you only look at families who are already on public assistance, you essentially oversample the poor, which conflates poor parenting while poor with poor parenting. Again, in our own state, we have to ask ourselves about what's happening with these ACEs scores, because right now, the only mandated population who have to receive the screens are kids in Medi-Cal. So what does it mean if kids in Medi-Cal are the only population for whom we're going to collect ACEs scores? What are the implications of that? And does it matter that the required portion of the screen doesn't even ask about experiences with racism? There is an optional additional screener that you can add that asks about experiences with discrimination and racism, but it's not in the required screener. From Ruha Benjamin again, we have to pay attention to times in which the data gathering protocols that we have ignore racism and ignore racial hierarchies, because that ignoring allows those hierarchies actually to be amplified. And so we have to ask, what are the implications of medicalizing adversity and pathologizing and then potentially surveilling the families who are affected. I think one of the implications is that it can reinforce structural whiteness. And I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. And perhaps most importantly, it leaves the harms that are actually created and maintained by systems underanalyzed and underaddressed because we hone in only on individuals and families. So what do I mean by it can reinforce structural whiteness? So first, too often whiteness is normative. It's shaping everyone's access to power and resources, but we don't talk about it. So whiteness is different than white. White is a racial status based on someone's perceived skin tone. But whiteness is that structural apparatus that then confers certain advantages, privileges onto white folks as a population based on their perceived racial status. It does that through laws and policies and norms that empower, normalize, favor, and reward white folks as a population. Whiteness is that boost that individual white folks need above the hardships they may face in their life to give them certain advantages and privileges other racial and ethnic groups are excluded from. Whiteness functions in 4 ways, and I'll just go through the definitions so that you can use them in your own experience. 1, white hegemony, which is a form of racial exclusion and discrimination that establishes and reinforces racial hierarchies in which white people nearly exclusively hold decision-making power. We have a healthcare infrastructure and a child-serving safety net infrastructure that is a white hegemony in this state and in this country because primarily white people hold decision-making power. White supremacy is a form of racial exclusion and discrimination that creates and maintains a racial ordering of humans and resources that reinforces the racial dominance of whites. That's usually done through deprivation or through violence. And we've covered in this presentation a bit of the inequality that exists in our political economy, but also how police violence can reinforce white supremacy. White privilege is a form of racial exclusion and discrimination that preferences white folks through disproportionate access to resources associated with mobility. And we covered those mobility gaps for Black and white boys. And white normativity refers to forms of racial exclusion and discrimination that naturalizes power asymmetries between white and non-white folks as being primarily meritocratic. This is where we say, you know, the reason white folks hold positions of power is because they're more deserving than other racial and ethnic groups. So ACEs screeners like Pearls are trying to capture experiences with abusive, impaired, or absent caregivers. But we have to understand reported ACEs in relationship to structural racism, which disappears caregivers, or social hierarchies that entrench white supremacy, and the structural inequalities that racist laws, policies, and norms create and normalize. So how can our approach to addressing adversity challenge and expose systems that perpetuate inequality? Who watches the system when the system is profoundly attuned to watch us? Ultimately, the process of collecting this data to assess risk for behavioral health outcomes and adult health outcomes through the ACEs screeners, and then to use that risk assessment to grant access to vital community resources like healthcare, is inherently a negotiation in power, in ownership, and social control. And we have to understand it as such. And so I present all this to say, we have to figure out how we walk upright in what I consider a crooked room, and one that is medicalizing the socio-political problem. You know, I'm not sure it's possible because many of these decisions are already being made and it's underway. But perhaps there's a way that we can arrange ourselves in groups, in the wonderful organizing that MBK already does to bring coalitions together and convene folks so that we can actually right the room instead of having to orient ourselves upright alone. I think ultimately, and I'm just going to go through a couple of ways that we could start to do that. First, I think we need police-free hospitals. And here in San Francisco General and at the DPH, they are going through a process to propose removing the sheriff from DPH clinics and our general hospital. And it's really critical because, as they acknowledge, entangling sheriff's presence within our medical care presumes the concept of safety requires armed law enforcement for all, which is an assumption that invariably leads to harm for many. We need police-free schools, y'all. And we presented some of that data, and if folks are interested, we could talk more about it. Here, I highlight the work of Black Organizing Project out of Oakland, whose incredible decades of efforts culminated just a few months ago in Oakland Unified terminating their relationship with OPD. We need to invest in a care economy. So it's incredible that that our state assembly passed SB 803, which which created a process for peers, for young folks to be certified and trained and then reimbursed by Medicaid for being a behavioral health intervention for other young people. We need to shift the money that we put into the provider class, which is, again, one of the wealthiest, and I say this as a person who's a part of this class, one of the wealthiest and predominantly white classes in our state, and invest that in young people and folks who are weathering the burdens of intergenerational harms. We need to invest in mutual aid. You know, when D'Angelo asked me to talk, we started talking about the Crisis Act. This was huge, and it was a step forward for our state when our state assembly nearly unanimously passed AB 2054, which created that pilot grant program so people didn't have to call the police when they needed help, especially if their crisis was one that was better dealt with their neighbors or other social service providers. Unfortunately, Governor Newsom vetoed the Crisis Act, but I know MBK and other groups, and I list the bill's co-sponsors at the bottom here, will continue to do this work. But having it be state sanctioned was important, but we'll continue to do it without the state's stamp of approval. We also have to just straight up redistribute wealth, right? Reparations. I think when we're talking about what anti-racism looks like, reparations is like 1, 2, and 3. We have to do that because we know because of those gaps in economic mobility and widening inequality in our country, for every dollar of wealth held by a household with white children, households with Black children only have a penny. Some people say that the way that you could do that is to raise the minimum wage. And here I quote the Roosevelt Institute because I think they get it totally right. Yes, we need to raise the minimum wage. And yes, that will benefit Black folks. But it will not change the fact that a dollar of income in Black hands buys less safety, less health, less wealth, and less education than a dollar in white hands. We need reparations, and we have to abolish racism everywhere it exists. Finally, we have to confront whiteness. And I'm going to close here with a summary from the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission was a commission put together by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1967, after that long, hot summer of 1967. It had 10 members, 8 of whom were white men, and they came to a conclusion that white folks have to sit with. They said, this is our basic conclusion. Our nation is moving toward 2 separate societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. But this deepening racial division is not inevitable. Movement apart can be reversed. Choice is still possible. And I put an asterisk here because these 8 white men, mostly from the Midwest, said, what white Americans have never fully understood, but what Black Americans can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the material conditions in which Black folks live. White institutions created those material conditions. White institutions maintain those material conditions. And white society condones the health gaps that live on the other side of that great inequality. So in the end, I hope what we're moving towards is relationship-centered healing, where we acknowledge that part of the work of racism is to fracture and scatter families and communities. And so we have to be a part of strengthening and reunifying those connections. So I will stop here and open it up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyd. I hope that you have a few minutes at the end just to scroll through the chat and see all of the praise and accolades and amens and fire emojis that were there. So now is the point in the discussion where I light my imaginary fireplace and replace my cup of coffee with a cup of brandy, and we just sit and have a good old conversation as 2 pediatricians. So one of the things that I'd love to hear from you, on this call, we have over 100 participants right now. It's a combination of healthcare providers, whether physicians or nurses, social workers, public health workers, people who are delivering services to youth across the city and across the state in various ways. And for many of us, we wonder, how do we stand up in a crooked room? And so I'm wondering if you can just share with us a little bit about your story and about how you got here, how you even realized the room was crooked, and what steps you took to be able to stand up more erect.
Ooh, thank you for that question, Tip. And I wonder how you do this too. I mean, first I have to acknowledge I didn't always see the crookedness of the room. I was that person who tilted myself to that 35 degree to say, I think we need to be doing more about toxic stress. I think screening is the way that we understand who's affected. And it was only in conversations, honestly, with other Black providers, with Black pediatricians, Black nurses who said, I've looked at some of those questions, or, I've had that screener when I take my kids in and something's not right about it. That had me sit with it for a second to say, what might not be right about it? And I think it's from, I guess, being in community with other folks who were willing to say that uncomfortable truth to me, and then being open to being in that struggle with people. I think it's hard. We are in the midst of multiple strategies to shift systems in our state to try to address adversity, which is ultimately a good goal. But we all think differently about what that strategy should look like. And I think it is loving struggle that will bring us to the right place where we all can feel comfortable, like this is the way to move forward. And so I'm grateful to all the people who just said to me on the side, hey, is something off about this, so that I could take a second and look more closely and learn more.
Thanks, Dr. Boyd. I would encourage everyone, put your questions for Dr. Boyd in the chat and I'll be filtering them through her. One of the questions we have is, have you been in contact with ACEs Aware and with the Surgeon General about some of the concerns that these providers and mothers and fathers of color have brought to you?
Absolutely. So Dr. Burke Harris, I know well. She used to practice here in San Francisco. I knew her since I was a resident. We have been in touch. I have actually talked to her staff, and we presented together side by side at the National Medical Association, which is like the Black AMA essentially, created when the AMA, the American Medical Association, excluded Black folks. We presented together. I introduced her and I gave this very presentation, not in its entirety because, she's the headliner. So I had like 20 minutes, but I basically said, we need to look at adversity as a socio-political problem and not a medical problem. And the follow-up was that I met with her staff, which was really great. I think it's a challenge because what do you do when then you land on different sides? When you say, I see what you say, I see you, I hear you, but I disagree. I think it's why when people invite me to talk about it, I want to respectfully share like what could be on another side, to say, if you also hold these concerns, like share them, so that maybe with the critical mass, we would have enough power to maybe shift what this looks like in the state.
Thanks for sharing that. Some people may be wondering, you are lifting your voice in so many different ways, right? So you have, you've cited many of your articles, opinion pieces in very high quality journals. You blog, you have, I think, 17 million followers on Twitter. You give presentations all across the country and all across the world to lift your voice. For individuals on here, we have a lot of trainees who are on the call. And again, people who are on different phases in their journey towards this anti-racism praxis. Can you give people some tips for how they can use their voice to address some of these issues?
Oh, that's such a great question. One, I have found Twitter to be really useful. I think it is both a useful platform and it can be really toxic. So one, it's really useful because I was able to connect to folks who had a larger platform than me early on and find other people across the nation who were doing similar work and just shoot people DMs. Hey, can I write with you? Can I think with you? Can I join your initiative? So it's a really effective way to connect. So even as students, I think it's an effective way to reach out. Students reach out to me all the time through Twitter, and I welcome that. I say it's a toxic platform because I'll also caution folks, particularly folks of color and women of color who join Twitter. I have also, this has happened to many women on Twitter, but I have joined the women on Twitter who have also been harassed. If you're somebody who publicly speaks out about white supremacy and racism, there are scary people out there, and Twitter is, a global platform. And so just being careful about what information you release about your own personal life, I think is important. So while you grow your platform, you can also keep a buffer of safety for yourself if you can.
So you talk about keeping yourself safe. I know that there have been a lot of conversations about Black women and Black bodies and brown bodies not being safe, whether that's from physical danger or emotionally. As you're doing this really hard and really challenging work, what are you doing to keep yourself safe, Dr. Boyd?
Ooh, that's such a good question and such a loving question. Can we just acknowledge that I talk a lot of places where people don't ask me things like this?
And I guess the follow-up is, what can we do to help keep you safe, Dr. Boyd? Because you have a whole community of 118 followers now. So what are you doing to keep yourself safe, and what can we do to support you in this work and keep you safe?
That is so just lovingly received. I think one, I have learned that I don't want to move or do anything that doesn't include other folks who are also in that movement building space. Like, I am not, as much as I teach about this work, I didn't originate it. You know, I didn't make up the word abolition. I'm not the first person to say we need police-free hospitals and police-free schools. I'm joining and trying to add whatever I have and the resources I can bring to these other conversations that are pre-existing. So I think, honestly, giving each other cover and moving in tandem is a really effective way to stay safe and to be effective in our work. I also have to say, just on a personal note, I think being mindful about my personal space. I don't know how much you guys have felt like Zoom is kind of encroaching on your home space, but you know, you've probably seen my man walking in the back. Like, we live in a 1-bedroom apartment. Like,
You're all up in your house right now, Dr.
Right? Like, this is it. This is you've seen my entire place right now. And so it takes up a ton of space when I do these. And when you're talking about racism day in and day out and Black death, it, messes up the vibe in here. So I also think I've had to put some limitations and parameters around how often I'll speak, who I'll speak to. Because at first I was just like taking every invitation to try to spread the message, but I need to be in places where there's cover, where there's loving struggle, where we're all trying to move forward, not just with people who are trying to like extract things from me too.
Thank you for that. There are a couple questions in the chat specifically about ACEs. So one is just a comment and an acknowledgement that pushing back on ACEs screening as a clinical process is difficult, and kind of the horse is already out of the barn for many people, particularly given the financial incentive to providers. So for those where they don't feel empowered or have the power to kind of push back on it and it's happening, what are your suggestions for kind of how to operationalize it in the best way and the safest way possible? And a related question to that is, we know that they're investing lots of money into paying providers to do it, into training providers to do it, but what about the resources for providing to families once they screen positive? And do you have any information related to that?
These are huge and challenging questions. I actually haven't been sure how we can address it at the provider level because, I think it was Prop 15, like after this became law, that it's mandated that we universally screen. And then after they incentivized the universal screens, and many clinics, especially during COVID, are now resource strapped, I understand why clinics will go through the process. I think consider talking to patients about the implications of the data that they're going to share with you before they share it. So instead of just giving somebody a piece of paper in the waiting room, let them know what that paper means. Like, hey, this is going to be probably de-identified and then put into a larger database about ACEs. Like, you are probably contributing to a large research study our state will have collecting data about adversity in the state. So be mindful that your responses will not be linked to you, but they will be a part of a larger collection of data for our state. Be mindful that what you say on this form has implications. And if you check off some of these boxes, we are mandated or may feel a responsibility to refer you to Child Protective Services. Like, I think you should let people know that. And then if you can let people know and then people refuse the screener, I think, that's how clinical care should go. Informed consent, and then they have Ruha Benjamin describes it as informed refusal. We give people enough information so they can make the right decision for themselves. And if the decision is not to fill it out, that's what we support. So I think setting it up for people so they understand. I'll also say ACEs Aware has an entire initiative in like these community grant programs that was shrunk because of COVID budget cuts, but will still support clinics that are trying to figure out that question. What is the right way for our population to ask these questions now that it's mandated? And CalQuick, which I don't even remember now what it fully stands for, but basically it's like the group that is overseeing those community pilots so that they can take all the learning and disseminate them out. So I do think they'll try to give even more guidance about how to do it because they're mostly focused on what it means for providers. So to the second piece of that question, it means there isn't a ton on the other side. Where do you refer people? I think they're trying to create in the behavioral health space ways that if you get your ACEs score, then you qualify for certain services, which we already talked about why that's problematic, but there will be behavioral health services for people who have higher scores. The question is, what about people who refuse it? Can they still get their behavioral health services? What about people whose scores are low because they're not going to accurately answer something about such private details of their lives, or because they fear, some punitive treatment if they answer certain questions in certain ways? So I think the other side of that remains to be seen.
Thank you for providing those very concrete strategies for what individuals can do in practices that are already doing some ACEs screening so that they can do it in a way where you have informed consent and informed refusal. I think that that's really powerful. And how can we as providers start giving some more power back to our patients and our families in this process? So thank you for sharing that. Related to that, one of the things that you touched on towards the end was around relationship-centered healing, and I really like that. And do you have any advice for us when we're going into our practices, working with clients and working with patients on how we can begin having some relationship-centered healing in those interactions?
Oh, I love that you touched on this one. I mean, I wish this is what all the money was going towards. Like what drives adversity is the things that impair caregivers and separate them from their kids. So all of our resources have to be going into that relationship. It's not just about what the clinician feels with the patient. It's about what that patient feels with their own caregivers. And that's what we should be encouraging and modeling and supporting with whatever limited time we have with folks. So talking about, how are y'all getting along? What's going on in the household? What are the things that are keeping you guys from building in the way that you need to? Talking to parents, what's keeping you from showing up in your kids' lives in the ways that you would like to? And then going to the state and saying, I need money for that, right? Because most of what's keeping parents from doing that is that growing inequality I was showing, is that folks don't make a living wage, that parents are trying to meet their kids' basic needs. And so that means that they can't meet their kids' social and emotional needs. And so I think we as a care infrastructure have to go to the state and be like, we could do something about that. We do have tens of millions of dollars to give to somebody. Why don't we give it to families to make sure they can show up? I'll give one example from here in San Francisco. They're going to do a pilot of universal basic income for moms, Black mothers in particular, for 6 months after delivery to try to narrow the maternal mortality gaps by race in our city. I think it's a good example of what it means to like just give resources to families, give families money to cover the gaps that inequality has created in their lives.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Ignacio saying how heavily youth are impacted by these decisions. And MBK is an organization that really likes to uplift the voices of youth. So do you have any advice on how we can better get youth involved on these issues around public health and bring their voices to the table?
Ooh, I love that question. One, I love the young people who frame this space. I think when we come together in convenings and have opportunities to build and organize, I think having young people lead it, open it, close it, be a part of it, I think is really critical. I think this education should be intended not just for providers, which is what the state is doing right now to train providers about ACEs so that providers can then train family members. I think we should just go directly to young folks and say, this is what we understand about adversity. And then add to that education, which I think is also somewhat lacking in this current frame, what we know about protective factors. Like this is what we know about what's working for you, things that'll help you get through this so that young people don't have to feel like they have some sentence over their lives that they can't get out of. Like, oh, well, that happened to me. I couldn't even control that. And now I'm just going to definitely have this bad outcome. Like, no, there's absolutely great data about protective factors that they can participate in. And then the last thing I'll say is just opening up job opportunities. I think that SB 803 was so huge because now young folks can be hired. We have a huge behavioral health workforce shortage in our state. There aren't even enough psychologists and psychiatrists if we wanted every person who screens positive to be seen. So why don't we bring more young folks into this profession and then provide opportunities for upward mobility through healthcare, which is a really durable industry.
Do you have any other advice about how to bring young folks into this profession? I think we may have some young folks on this call who are like, oh, I want to be like Dr. Boyd when I grow up. So how do we get more young people engaged in becoming providers in various different ways?
Ooh, great question. One, I think mentorship is huge. Finding people at your own institution or at nonprofits that you visit or community organizations, find an adult who you respect, who you think is interesting, who does work that you like, and then talk to them. Ask them how they got to where they are, spend time with them. Sometimes shadowing can be really helpful. We do that in clinical medicine, like if you're interested in being the type of clinician who sees patients one-on-one, like following a doctor during their day and seeing what that feels like to be in that exam room or be in the hospital, I think can be really useful so that you can get a sense of what the career feels like. But I think the most important part of trying to become a part of this profession is finding a mentor who will hold you down, and then finding a sponsor, which is mentors kind of give you advice, they help you understand how to go, and sponsors then give you an opportunity, somebody who says, hey, we have an internship, I picked you. You know, people who can really put you on, I think is a helpful way. And then just, if you're already learning about inequality and racism and you're taking science courses, never count yourself out for medical school and residency, even when it may seem unlikely, or maybe you haven't taken the right classes yet. Don't worry, there's always ways to come back into the field, and mentors will help you find those ways.
So you talked about mentorship and sponsorship, and I think that there are some people on this call who may have some power and privilege that they can wield. So what are some ways in which we can open up doors and become sponsors for other individuals?
Ooh, I love this. I mean, I saw that UC Davis was on the call, and I think having folks at UC Davis intentionally open the doors of the institution to say, like, we have planned events or we're inviting young folks in so that you can be mentored. I don't know UC Davis because I don't work there, but I'm sure there are programs where UC Davis has pipeline programs for people who are interested in coming to UC Davis later on. Having those folks maintain those relationships, I think, can be really useful. I have been thinking honestly because a lot of students reach out to me, and right now I'm like the busiest I've ever been in my career. So sometimes I don't have time to give as much as I want to individual students. We'll have like brief, quick conversations. So I've also been thinking about opening up spaces where we have like a Zoom with just young folks and a bunch of people come, so I can talk to as many people as possible and then schedule those more regularly. So I think offering maybe our institutions to do that, thinking about how we can do that individually. And for you and I, Tiff, it reminds me to think about how our AAP, our American Academy of Pediatrics, for folks who are interested in going into medicine, can also do that in our area.
I love that, a group Zoom where like everybody could just soak up all that Dr. Boyd, all the gems that you're dropping. That's a really great idea. I love it. Invite me to the next one.
You should lead one. Tiff is amazing. I appreciate all of these questions, but everyone, I'm also so curious about, where you stand. Like, how have you approached this? How our state is approaching ACEs? Because I know you're also newer to the area. Mm-hmm. Can you share some of your perspective, kind of coming in and seeing this approach and what you think about it?
You're just gonna flip the whole script. I'm supposed to.
No, I'm not supposed to do that. But if you wanted to share, I'm open to hear and learn from you.
I am new to the state, and as D'Angelo mentioned, how do you recognize that you have two ears and one mouth? And so the environment here is very different from the environment in Philadelphia. The patient population here is very different from the patient population. The political landscape is very different. And so I appreciate having the opportunity to be in spaces and Sacramento has so many leaders who are championing social justice and health justice. And so I I try to do a lot of listening to learn about what are the problems here and figuring out kind of how I can best lend my voice. And so that's one place where I'm starting. I think when it comes to the ACEs, you know, I'm a researcher, Dr. Boyd. And so I do use it as a research tool, and I do consent people when I use it and make them aware about how it's being used, and also recognizing the limitations of research tools and the population that ACEs was developed and validated in, which is very different than the patient population that we take care of. And like, you know, ACEs were validated it with, you know, a population that was mostly like upper income, educated, employed, and insured. But there are expanded ACEs that look at vulnerabilities at the community level, including racism, including community level violence, and how do we address those issues. And then the other lever that I try to pull on is, I think that there's a lot of focus on resilience, and there's some questions about resilience that I hope we can get to in the chat. And how can we as providers move? I think a resilience-based approach is important, but how can we as providers move past telling people this is how you can be more resilient to dismantling the structures that are oppressing people, right? Like, you know, I don't think the issue is we need to be more resilient, we need to be less oppressed. And so what can we do to kind of funnel resources into dismantling the oppression? So that's kind of where I am right now, but I'm learning from all my Cali people, including people like you, Dr. Boyd. But related to resilience, there is a question in the chat around shifting medical systems, thinking that resilience in behavioral supports means outsourcing to getting help from professionals. And one of the questions is, how can we shift that so that resources are more for families, and valuing the supports that are within families and helping them, as opposed to kind of working against families, especially families of color?
I think that's the critical question. Like, if I was going to say, where is my advocacy on this topic going at the state, it's to, at the state level, say, you need to put at least just as much, but I would argue the lion's share of our state's resources for this issue going directly to families. I think, and I mean like the money, like instead of having that money pay $39 per provider for giving that screener, that money should just go directly to families. And I think closing some of those resource gaps will help families, I guess, nurture their own relationships with each other. Because so much of what's fracturing that is that folks don't have the resources they need to show up in each other's lives, you know, in supportive ways. I mean, this is what drives violence. Sometimes when we talk about abolition, people are like, well, how can we get rid of the police? Because what about community violence? But it's like, well, community violence is also absolutely born of like abject poverty, of people having no other way out and creating a separate informal economy that uses violence to ensure that you can meet your basic needs. Like, why do we have folks living like that in such a wealthy country and a wealthy state like ours? So one, I think shifting those state resources is going to be one of my points of advocacy that I think other people should call for. Like, I think it's a legitimate critique to, when you go to presentations or if you have an audience with the Surgeon General, to ask, like, how much resources will next go to families directly, and not just through their health insurance, but directly with no middleman. I think that's really important. And then I also think supporting the community-based organizations that then support families and youth too is really important too. And I think groups like MBK have a great role in that.
Shifting the resources is important. And in addition to advocacy to change some of these policies for how the resources are doing, I think there's still things that we can do now. So Eric in the chat, who's one of the pediatricians here at UC Davis, is suggesting some strategies. So how can you take $25, $29 per screen, $39, whatever it's going to be, and put it into a fund to use for resources for how you can address positive screens, whether it's hiring social workers, you know, giving vouchers for food. Do you have any other, have you thought about any other creative ways that, until we can change what the policies are for individual practices who may be on the line, and figuring out how they can use that money to help support families?
I love that example, Dr. Eric. Thank you for sharing it. I think I also have to acknowledge that the clinics that often serve communities of color are often resource strapped themselves. Like, I don't want to pretend that people don't need, some clinics maybe need that $39 per screen to pay for other, vaccines and other care items that are, that don't have a return on their investment for them, like for that same population. So I think it would be amazing if they could use that money to hire other folks or to directly support the community or hire resources that they just give out to the community. I also understand if some of those clinics need to keep those resources so that they can keep their doors open. I think maybe that's how I answer it, because I don't want clinics to feel like they shouldn't take the money that they need to, because part of inequality is not just that, individual families don't have it. It compounds to the resources you go to, or, the clinics you go to, the hospitals you go to are resource strapped as well. And everyone's trying to deal with with racial capitalism, with the fact that we allow some people to have everything and the rest of us, don't. So I think I love that example.
Thanks. And so you brought up the issue around youth violence, and I think that maybe we can pivot the discussion there for a little while, because it's something that certainly impacts our community here. This summer we saw heightened levels of violence. So I wonder if we can just talk about that a little while. And so for the providers who are on the call, as we think about structural racism and personally mediated racism and internalized racism as drivers for some of this violence that we're seeing, what do you think are some of the biggest myths around violence in our communities that providers who are on this call who are addressing trauma need to be aware of, that need to be dismantled?
The first one that came to mind is that myth about Black on Black violence, that I think has been kind of repurposed during this current uprising to say, like, why are Black folks tearing down their own houses, or why are you looting your own community? Like, first, for every racial group, most of the violence committed in your racial group is intra-racial. So it's both true that Black folks who are the victims of violence tend to have a Black perpetrator. That's also true for white folks. White folks who are victims of violence tend to have a white perpetrator, and Latinx folks who are victims of violence tend to have a Latinx perpetrator. So all violence tends to be intra-racial. That is likely a result of profound segregation in society, that people live near folks who share your racial or ethnic background. So that's one myth. The repurposing of that myth now is even more troubling, where people say, well, why are Black folks looting? And here I often turn to the words of Kimberly Jones. I don't know if all y'all saw that video. I'll try to find a link and drop it after I say this, but she basically highlighted the fact that Black folks don't own anything. Like, first, it's not looting if we want to talk about what really is looting in this country, it's our political economy that's extracting resources from all of us and giving it to the most wealthy folks, right? It's the CARES Act that gave a one-time payment of $1,200 to some, not even all, US households, and gave hundreds of millions of dollars to the wealthiest corporations and elites. It's the fact that we pay corporations before we pay people. Like, that is looting of our own tax dollars. Now, that's why I'm not upset if somebody steals a cell phone. Like, that to our economy doesn't do anything to anybody else's lives. The other stuff is contributing to these resource gaps. But then the other thing Kimberly Jones says is, like, what kind of society are you living in if you would reach through a broken plate glass window to grab a cell phone? Like, what kind of extreme are people living in? What kind of poverty have we created that people go that far? And then why would we fault them when we've driven them that far? So I also think it's important to acknowledge, like, part of our extractive economy creates the conditions that breed unrest. This is the result. This is the conclusion of that Kerner Commission that we landed on. If folks are like, where does this come from? The entire purpose of the Kerner Commission was to say, what drove this? And they landed on white society drove this. And mob and police violence against Black people drives this response. It drives an uprising that sometimes includes violence. So it's why people who are abolitionists say you know, if we want to get rid of the conditions that create community violence, you don't invest in more punitive supports that can only respond to that violence with violence. You invest in the social supports. You invest in people having all of their needs met so that they're thriving, not just barely working to survive.
Thank you for that. As we think about violence in the community, you know, APHA was this past week. I'm sure you were heavily involved in that, Dr. Boyd. One of the sessions on Saturday centered around Sacramento leaders. And one of our nursing leaders here talked about violence, not only in the community, but like, let's talk about violence in the healthcare system and ways in which we are perpetuating violence against patients, violence and racism, which comes in the form of not believing Black pain and not believing Black voices. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the ways in which violence shows up in our healthcare system and what ways we can begin to stand up against it? And you know, one of the quotes that you know how much I love Dr. Kamara Jones, and so you talked about sometimes racism looks like inaction in the face of need. And as we think about this violence and racism in the healthcare system, what are some of the needs and what are the ways in which we as providers have been inactive, and how can we step into action?
Gosh, this is such an important question. I mean, that we could answer in a bunch of ways. One, we could answer it historically. What does violence look like in healthcare? And for Black folks, for the formerly enslaved, for Indigenous populations, it has looked like experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
It has looked like actual violence, non-consented experimentation. I think if we look to today, you still see forms of that structural violence where you don't, I think inaction in the face of need is the perfect way to say it, where people don't have equal access to resources that are life affirming and life saving. Our healthcare system perpetuates that because we also are built in this political economy where, you know, you can make more money off of populations who have private insurance than those who don't have insurance or who are on Medi-Cal or Medicaid. And so we orient our system towards the private insurance market, which shifts us away from communities of color and segregates our care. So I think that is absolutely a form of violence. And, you know, one that I've been speaking out against is the inaction in the face of police violence as this deadly risk in folks' lives, and particularly Black men and boys' lives. But also, you know, we have to say Black girls and Black women too, and Indigenous populations. Indigenous populations in some areas of this country have police violence rates that are the highest of any racial group, particularly in the Southeast. So I think the fact that we have done so little to address police violence is like, it's some form of morbid complicity. Like, we tolerate it, we don't speak out against it. And even when folks start to speak out against it, you know, other folks will silence them and say, you know, and this has happened to me, let me just be fully transparent. You know, in 2014, when Tamir Rice was murdered in Cleveland, playing with that toy in a park, which is what little boys do, you know, I went to the American Academy of Pediatrics. I emailed the president at that time. And I said, what is the AAP going to say about the murder of this little boy? Mm-hmm. You know, like, if Mike Brown was too old, he was a teenager. Mike Brown should not have been too old. But if whatever, you want to disconnect yourself from what's happening to Ferguson, what about what happened to Tamir? Like, surely you will say something about this. And everyone said, nah, you know, we don't feel comfortable saying something. We rely on police because we're mandated reporters. Police help us when children are being abused. And it was like this, it was this uncomfortable realization that we as a field, even pediatricians who we consider like really nice, you know, clinicians, we also rely on the carceral state. We also rely on the violence of policing to enforce some of our own responsibilities. And because of that, you know, people were loath to then say something bad about the police. You know, the first article that I tried to publish on police violence in pediatrics, the Journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, I couldn't publish it until it was accepted. And then the final criteria that you had to change to publish it, they said, say something nice about the police. I kid you not, say something nice about the police. This is a paper about police violence and how it hurts kids. Why would I then say something? It doesn't make sense. but that's the frame in the world that certain folks live in. And, you know, the AAP and the leadership at that time were white, and they're white now. And that's what happens when it doesn't affect you in that same way. Maybe people kind of divorce themselves from their own responsibility in it. And I think that violence speaks volumes. Gladly, the AAP has come a long way, and now we are able to work on a policy statement on this topic. But I think we as a medical infrastructure have done almost nothing about police violence, and it's ridiculous.
I think that's a really great example, because it's not that the AAP has come a long way, is that they've been pushed and pulled a long way.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that, because I think it's a good example for the audience as they are kind of running up against walls sometimes in the work that everyone is doing, and knowing that like that persistence is needed. And so thank you for sharing the story of some of the challenges that you've had in getting the work done, because a lot of times people just see like, oh my goodness, Dr. Boyd is so successful in doing everything. But also people seeing the challenges that you've had in doing this work may be encouraging to them as they are also having challenges, and knowing that if they keep pushing, that there may be some action and some change. So thank you so much for sharing that. I've monopolized the conversation with most of my questions because I just wanted to have a good talk with you, but I will end with maybe with another question from the audience. Because I think that this is something real for providers, and something that you can speak to as someone who is in primary care, who's doing this work. And it's the issue of time. So there's, as you kind of talk about how do we build these kind of this relationship-centered healing in our interactions with our patients, as we are potentially screening for ACEs and trying to provide resources, talking to kids and talking to families about racism, and there's just so little time. So as someone who is like in the field doing this work, do you have practical advice for providers for how to kind of fit all of this really important information into these very brief encounters with limited resources and time?
That's a great question. I mean, this may be unsatisfying, but don't fit it in. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's why I turned to advocacy. Like, the constraints on our time when we see patients are driven by a profit model that wants you to see as many patients as possible. Instead of fitting ourselves into that profit model, we have to become advocates to fight against it, to say, if I know these things need to happen for these patients, then insurance should reimburse it. I think a good example of that is what happened with SB 803. Once you said that you could train peers to be a behavioral health intervention, that stretches what we were asking providers to do. And it directly reimburses, using insurance, using Medicaid, it directly reimburses young people who should be being paid by the same, for-profit industry. So I think, one, we have to push back against it. And for my own sanity, instead of trying to contort in that crooked room, instead, I'm trying to right the room through my advocacy to say, actually, we should have more time, more people should be being paid to do this work. And some of these things are out of my own level of expertise. I think, as somebody who has learned and taught a lot about racism and its impacts on health, I will have a very different conversation with patients about racism than somebody who just did an ACEs aware screening and is now giving this screener. So I think it's also on providers to say, when it's outside your scope, if you shouldn't be going there, don't go there. Refer patients to somebody else who can go there with them, and then try to become better advocates so that we have more resources at our disposal for patients.
You better be careful. People are going to start referring all their patients to you. They're like, I'm just the doctor for you, Dr. Rhea Boyd. She's doing telehealth consults from her apartment in San Francisco. So I have 3 more minutes. And so maybe a good way to close is, as we think about MBK Sacramento Healthy Development, the strategic objective of this pillar is that all children have a safe and healthy start to develop cognitively, physically, socially, and emotionally. That children and youth grow up protected from trauma in communities that are safe from violence and crime, and that families have resources and support needed for a healthy child. I think you dropped so many gems today for ways in which we can begin to make that strategic objective a reality. But if you can leave our participants today with the biggest impact that you think they can make in terms of what practice change they can make within their practices when they go back to their practices, and what policy change they should advocate for in their communities. What would it be, Dr. Boyd?
I would say an important one that I think we all have to start thinking about is police-free clinics, police-free hospitals, and police-free schools. I think in our advocacy, we have to join alongside community organizations and young folks who have said, we don't feel comfortable with the police in our schools, with all of the data that tells us that police in schools means more Black and brown students, particularly Black girls, are going to be referred to law enforcement and arrested from their school. Like, we cannot have police in schools, and pediatricians and all child serving providers and organizations have to stand up and shout that. I think as clinicians, if you work in a healthcare setting, we also have to disentangle our relationship with the carceral state and call for police-free spaces in our hospitals. Patients are injured by police. Patients have been arrested from their bedside. Some mothers deliver their babies when they're shackled to the bed. All of that is abhorrent within any caring system. And so if we're really going to live up to what we claim to be, which is a care system, I think we have to build the infrastructure so that we no longer rely on police to solve conflicts in the hospital or to punish patients, which is what we sometimes do. So if folks are interested, I could share more about what they're doing at the General Hospital, or you can reach out to me. My email is the same as my Twitter, just add @Gmail. And we can connect. Thank you for all these questions.
That's a great, as just this past week, there was a patient who was shot by police in the hospital. And it just boggles my mind to think that someone with mental health illness is in the hospital in a setting where they're supposed to be getting help, and they're still not safe from harm from police in that setting. So I think that is a great kind of final place to close. I really hope you scroll through this chat just so that, just in case you just need to be built up and loved on. There's so much love for you in this chat right now. I know how busy that you have been and how many asks are being made of your time and your energy and your voice. And so I can't thank you enough on behalf of MBK and the community of Sacramento for making time to deliver this very important message. So many people have been filled up and blessed and inspired by your words. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Boyd. And you'll have, I think, 115 at least new followers at the end of this, and people who are going to be helping to support you and lift you up as you've helped to support us and lift us up today.
Thank you so much. This was such an honor. Thank you for all those beautiful questions. And to everybody, I'm going to read all of these comments. It's really an honor. And Dr. Tiffany is also on Twitter. Follow her as well.
I just joined. I'm trying to figure this Twitterverse out. I'll get it together at some point. All right. And I think I am passing it on back on to Ramsey, who will continue the rest of our program for today.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Boyd. You guys did phenomenal. So go ahead and leave some fire emojis in the chat. We're going to go ahead and move forward and reintroduce or just bring back our Sacramento-based creatives, Eric, Marcel, and Jasmine.
So once again, my name's Eric.
I'm Jazz.
And so the song that we're about to do, it's called Easy. And you can find that and the one that we just did come by on all streaming services under Eric Marcel. So my blasting fluorescent and shining from the sun, melanin glistening like the product of a million lives enshrined due to these times, these lines wide as ice. Heart's been frozen, my vices can't afford these prices, but I'm conditioned to buying, and they always supplying. So on my path to dying, cause that's what they want, to find our money, get jumped by the system. I pumped my blood, sweating my tears, years fading like deers in the headlights. Our peers keep on popping, our bodies just keep on dropping. We're playing Russian roulette. How soon did we forget that was just a debt? Our lives are seen as threats, they collect like a bounty. Regret being born, I guess it's a constant digest in disgust that reflect another terrorist threat, but they just represent that a change is coming next. We just gotta represent. Say I could be the change, we could be the change. Stand up, fight, that's how we rearrange. Cause in the end, we always say,
it's all so easy.
Say I could be the change, we could be the change. Stand up, fight, that's how we rearrange. Cause in the end, we always say,
it's all so easy.
what's the price of a black man's life? I checked the tote tag. Not 1 0 in sight. J. Cole wrote that. And not one change. I might start a revolution. I'm proving that it's all right. Cause tonight I don't need no camera action, no lights flashing, sure to get a reaction from the demographic. That's color change is drastic. Wrap them up in plastic, the present is just a fabric of the time wasted, looking for reparations. Acres in a mule, confused as you. When do we choose to use our civil rights and change our way of life? It's not a compromise, it's to stop our demise. That's why y'all die repping our melanin. Product mass developing, shackled down like the felon did, selling nothing enslaved. Look how it remains. But the same lives they hate will be the change. Say I can be the change, we can be the change. Stand up, fight, that's how we rearrange. Cause in the end, we always say,
it's all so easy.
Say I can be the change, we can be the change. Stand up, fight, that's how we rearrange. Cause in the end, we always say,
it's all so easy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're just being blessed today. I love it. I love it. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Dr. Christina. If you could, please just briefly introduce yourselves and take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Ramsey. My name is Christina Gilardi, and I'm honored to be a part of the Healthy Development Strategic Committee and here to share two things with you. The first is that we have an evaluation, and wondering if we can have that slide up so folks can take a picture of the QR code. We are really excited to be doing this work with you all, and we are planning to continue the series next year, and would love to hear from you about what works, what you'd like to see, what are opportunities. If you have ideas for speakers for next year, we'd really appreciate that. So you can either take a picture of the QR code, or it's also there at the bottom of the screen, and perhaps someone can pop it in the chat for everyone. But yeah, we look at these, we really try to hone the work that we are doing to best meet the needs that you all have and interests that you have in terms of moving the work forward. And then the second piece that I have to share with you is, next slide, please. Out of this work, several of us have come together to create a space that complements this healing and learning series. And it is a space for non-Black allies in the fight for racial justice. The goal is really to hold space for dialogue and action for those of us who are white or identify with having proximity to whiteness, so that we can really identify and leverage the privilege that we have to intentionally take action and dismantle structural racism and structural whiteness, as Dr. Boyd was talking about. And Dr. Johnson mentioned this quote, racism is inaction in the face of need. And so really making sure that those of us who have privilege can help to leverage that privilege to move this work forward and on behalf of my brother's keeper and our brothers and sisters of color. So we have been hosting these. We have done two. This is our third one. It's coming up on November 9th from 5:30 to 7 p.m. And you can register at the bit.ly address that is posted in the chat and on the screen. We really look forward to having these conversations about helping people who identify as allies move from learning to taking action and leveraging our privilege to do this work. And we're really excited to be doing this. So we hope you'll join us. Feel free to reach out to myself or to Katie, who just posted the link, if you have questions, and we hope you'll join us. Thanks, Ramsey.
Thank you, Christina. And for closing remarks, the star of the MBK Healthy Development Pillar, D'Angelo Mack.
No. All right. So just again, want to thank everybody for showing up and showing out. Want to definitely lift up Eric and Jasmine, our young musicians who came through and who we are doing this all for. Also want to lift up Dr. Johnson and Dr. Boyd for such an engaging and amazing bowl of fire that they gave us. Thank you for inspiring us to ask questions, motivate, and move in our spaces. I want to just take a quick moment to lift up my team, this great MBK Healthy Development Strategy team. Such an amazing gift of individuals who are passionate and concerned and doing their heart's work. So if the team could just in the reactions throw up a hand, a clap, so folks can see who you are as a part of this team. This could not be done, what we did today and what we continue to do. This could not be done without all of these wonderful individuals who make me look like I'm doing something well. So thank you. It's never about what I know. It's about who I know. And I'm so blessed and honored to know all of you.
D'Angelo, you went on mute. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I'm going to sell t-shirts to say you're on mute. So anybody want to buy those later, go ahead. But I put my email in the chat. If you want to be a part of the healthy development pillar or be involved or help us out as we're pushing, to support young boys and men of color, please email me to find out greater ways to be involved. Other than that, we look forward to being with you again. I heard many people ask, can I get the slides? Can I get the video? Can I get it like after this call? That's a little much. We're going to be busy with happy hour later. So we'll send you all the information. Hopefully by the start of next week, you'll get all this great information and to all those who registered. And at some point, it will be up on the MBK website. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us and taking the time. Thank you, Dalton, for coming through in the crunch. And again, just thank my team and all you continue to do. I love you guys. Until then, look out for email, and we'll see you at the next Healing and Trauma Learning Series. Thank you.
As we end with uplifting youth, can we have our Zoom organizers just pin Destiny on the screen for everybody to see as we all close out?
Is Destiny still with us?
She is still with us.
us.
There she is. Yes. Hey!
Hey! Bye, baby. Bye, baby. Shout out to Victoria and Sarah over at UC Davis for our Zoom connection. Thank you guys so much. Hey, cute.